You will, you'll use it in class for charts and things like that, so. But I feel like it's been out for at least since the last time I got it, like 2 years ago, so she should be able to find it, use copy somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine, honestly, probably cheaper. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and come on back together. I mean, we're still here, but you know what I mean. Alrighty. And so we're gonna have group 1 start, and I realized I didn't print a second copy of the assignment, so you all will have to read the question and then your answer. So
The first question was, what is the best way to reach Dr. Myers? Wondering, email. How do you set up a meeting with Dr. Myers? Calendly?
yep, and the link is right here in the syllabus. The syllabus is posted on Blackboard, so you can click the link, and you can't do that from the paper copy. And it's also under professor information on Blackboard.
And then number 3, who are the authors of your textbook? Probably gonna butcher this first name, but Newcrow and Fawcett. 4, look over the course objectives and summarize them for your classmates. We said comprehend and apply psychological statistics and assessment techniques. And then number 5, where will information for the course be made available on Blackboard?
Shocking, I know. Thank you, group 1, great job. Yeah, so let me just show you a couple highlights of Blackboard while we're on this bit. So you can find my information, including a link to my Calendly. So if you haven't used this before, it will bring you here. And let's say you're like, okay, I just need to ask her 1 question, so I want to set up a brief meeting. Alrighty, it looks like she's got some time next Monday. So, oh, you know what? I'm free at 3:50. And then you just basically put in your email. Make sure you put in your email correctly. Sometimes people type really fast and they're like, oh, I never got the reminder because you typed in your email wrong. So because then it will actually send it to you. You can add it to your calendar. It will give you reminders about the meeting, which is helpful. The syllabus can also be found here. Any announcements, I just realized they saw the announcements from last time, so I'll delete those so it's not confusing. Our Zoom info, which we'll get to in a minute, lecture notes, assignments that we'll do in class are posted here, and then review sheets. Later in the semester, we'll go over some SPSS stuff. Don't worry, we're going to go over it step by step by step. It's just a fancy Excel, basically, but the info for that is here. Info for your group project is here, and then various other things you need. The only other thing that might be really helpful right from the get-go is that there are also apps you can download if you prefer to just do this from your phone. But there are online scientific calculators that you can just use right on here, so you don't have to buy one. So, alrighty, group 2.
So question 6 was, what should you do if that person struggling with issue breaks and then plans instead of talking about the minor through school resources? Number 7, why is Dr. Myers recommending that you wear a mask? We said, well, we got recommended not provided equitable and adjust atmosphere for for learning if you're not protecting one another by masking.
Yeah, and just like little caveat with that, you all are adults, you can decide whether or not masking is something that's good for you or that you wanna do. I'm in a mask just because I have a lot of risk factors for COVID. I've had it twice, it's miserable, I don't wanna get it again. But yeah, just think about friends you might have that might have autoimmune disorders, things along those lines. And if you are gonna mask, unfortunately, all those masks we wore at the beginning of the pandemic don't work anymore. Cloth masks, surgical masks, the new variants just tear right through them. So you do need to upgrade. I wear KF94s, they fit better to my face than the KN95s. Or the N95s are better, but again, totally up to y'all, fully recognizing y'all are adults.
Question 8, what should you do if you have any illness who said do not come to class?
Don't come, y'all. You can sign in on the Zoom if you feel well enough to do so, but you can also just rest.
Number 9, what will happen if Dr. Mouse is sick? In Zoom meeting, if he's feeling comes apart, or in class, would you be notified by academic affairs?
Yeah, if I'm well enough to email you, y'all, I will. As I mentioned, I do have a 5-year-old. She's a little germ vector. And she does masks, but they take them up to eat and they can't wear them while they nap. So that's a big chunk of her day. And so if I get something, it's typically from her, unfortunately.
Number 10, who will record lectures, and who should not record lectures? Said Dr. Myers will record lectures, and students should not.
Yeah, and that's just because, again, I've never experienced this, but unfortunately, colleagues at other institutions have had people record class and then like post portions of it on TikTok, and like, I honestly don't care if you make fun of me, but I don't want you like making fun of each other. I want people to feel safe and open to learn in here. And I will record, I'm actually recording this right now. So if anyone wants to go back over the syllabus with us talking about it, you'll be able to post them on YouTube, and then I'll have a link to everything.
The one of them was rare lectures. It's class posted in some way.
Yep, exactly. Alrighty, group 3.
First question was the format where data. The type of assignments we'll have this class is short in class and on whatever topic that we're learning at the time. The date by which we need to set a meeting with Dr. Myers is September 22nd. How will we gather information for you at the end of the semester? We'll do that by having the partner and then testing out throughout the semester through different types of assessment, and then what is our final project, and it's describing a psychological test that is very useful.
You got it. Yeah, so just a excellent job. I'm just going to fill in a little more. So your exams are all take home, and open book up a note. Someone asked me during well, you all were working groups, if we're actually going to use our books, we will. I actually recommend you bring it to class, or if you have the ebook, make sure you have whatever device you access it on with you, because there are like tables and figures in here that we'll actually refer to during assignments. So yes, recommend that. This book has been out for a couple years, so you should be able to find used copies, or the ebook is pretty cheap. Fun fact, the first author, Newcraig, is actually a professor of counseling at ODU. But even though we're both in the same area, I've never met him. So I should probably like reach out at some point. Be like, what's up? I use your book. Yeah, so the assignments we'll do in class, some will be individual, a lot of them will be group. And then in addition to the Calendly link, because I know people who take night classes sometimes during the day, it's not going to work for you at all. I can totally set up something before or after class with anybody who needs to do it that way. The assessment report throughout the semester, yeah, as they said, you'll be pairing up with someone and you'll be giving each other psychological tests, various things, and you can decide individually whether you want it to be you or whether you want to kind of like be a character. Like I had someone who took this class once who just like, he had schizophrenia, and so he answered everything all semester as if he had schizophrenia. He did not really have schizophrenia, right? He just like wanted to make it interesting for his partner. And so these we'll do in class. You won't have to find time on your own to do these. And so that's one of the reasons why I like the night class for this class, is that you've got lots of time to do these. And so we'll do, basically you'll give a test as we talk about that type of test. And then, yeah, your major group project is in small groups. You're going to design, let's be honest, everyone who's ever done this class with me has designed a survey, basically a questionnaire, to measure some concept you're interested in. And so we're going to go through the process. I'm going to walk y'all through everything where you all will submit an IRB, an Institutional Review Board application. If you're like, that sounds like something you made up, we're going to go over what that is and how you do it. And then I plan to actually send those through the IRB because we're light on studies for people to do for course or extra credit this year. So I would love for you all to be able to offer your studies through SONA and get lots of people who need extra credit that way pretty easily. So you are going to design your own study and then give people 2 other existing questionnaires and some demographics, age, sex, that type of thing. And then you all will create a poster presentation based on that. And what I've done the past couple of years, just to like be a little more environmentally friendly, is y'all make the poster digitally and then we just present it this way instead of printing them out. And that's our final exam time, is that we do the presentations. Alrighty, group 4. Did we get all the way through group 3 stuff? Okay, just want to make sure I wasn't cutting you all off. Alright, group 4.
Question number 17 is, what is the weight for policy for this class? And it's not really, you don't have one, it's any and all for be accepted so far today.
Exactly. So I know that y'all have lives. If I turn in stuff late, I might get like one angry email, but I still get to turn it in. So like the idea that I'm somehow like preparing you for real life if I didn't accept late work is a little ludicrous. So yeah, you do it on your own time, but also don't let yourself get too behind, I would say.
And question 18, how many points total in the this class?
Yep, so if you miss a couple points here or there, don't freak out. You got a lot of leeway.
And what are 2 ways you can earn extra credit? First, pay research or write a short paper or
Yeah, and for this class, as long as it's not your own, like if everybody in this class, every group, I'm assuming will have somewhere between 3 and 5 groups throughout this class. If everyone posts them on SONA, and it's not your group, you can take part in your classmates' study and get extra credit for that. So I should also hopefully have a study, and then Dr. Ariel typically has 1 or 2 with his lab as well.
And then what should you do with accommodations and talk to Dr. Myers?
Yeah, and make sure you use those accommodations. This class in particular, we're going to actually like talk about the assessments that are done to get those accommodations. They're not giving people special treatment, they're just leveling the playing field. So please, please, please make use of them. And Crit and I get along really well. So, you know, if there's any sort of confusion, we can work together for you.
And then what are the names of the 2 full-time members that were tested class, April Houston and Brandon Boston?
Yeah, and so y'all can go see them for free. And they also have some interns who work with them. Therapy is really expensive if you don't have insurance in the real world. Those of you who've had me before have heard me say this before. But I had a client when I was on my internship year, my residency year, who didn't have insurance, and I didn't set the fees, the facility did. She had to end up paying somewhere around $250 or $275, split between money to see me and then a facility fee on top of that. And that was for every session she came to. So free is really good. I also have a list of resources. And then if you're ever in crisis, I know a couple organizations in the area that are like Patient First, but for mental health issues and really work to keep you out of the hospital. If you want to stay engaged with your life. So please let me know if you ever want that information.
And what is the policy on using AI? Payments and it's zero and then
yeah, and you know, we'll talk about AI because it's certainly going to start affecting things like research and assessment. You know, one of the companies I work with to collect data, their April Fool's jokes this year was like, AI participants for your studies. And everyone was like, yeah, good. But I think that's probably unfortunately not that far away, right? And so what are the ethics of that? And the professors are honestly really trying to figure this out. Last week we had a guest speaker during our faculty pre-session talking about it. There's also a speaker on campus right now. She did a session right before this. She's doing one tomorrow afternoon. So we're learning how we can use it in fun ways in class and enhance y'all's experiences, and educate you about it because it's so new that we're still learning about it. Alrighty, yeah, and just don't cheat. I mean, this class I give you, take home exams so that you feel like you have time to work through the material and whatnot. So, and come see me if you have any questions or concern. All right, so I'm going to go over our schedule. The one thing about teaching this class on a Thursday in the fall is we end up having a couple weeks where we don't have class just because of break schedule. So that is weird. I fully acknowledge that. But I've built some stuff in to sort of compensate for that without giving y'all like too much extra work to do. So as I mentioned today, we're doing this introduction and then we'll do our first chapter. Next week, we'll talk about ethical and legal issues. So, you know, what laws do psychologists and counselors have to follow? What are the ethics you need to consider as you go through assessing someone? And then we're going to start talking about some of the properties of tests. So reliability and validity, basically, are two things that tell us whether a test or an assessment is good, whether it's measuring what it's supposed to measure, whether it actually relates to that concept, whether it's consistent and accurate. Then we'll start talking a little bit about data, because once you've done an assessment, what you're left with is data. And so we'll talk about what are raw scores, what does that mean? We'll talk about how to interpret scores. And then we'll start talking about specific types of assessments, including educational assessments. One thing that I missed as I was going through here is in 2 weeks, you'll turn in your possible topics for the group project. This is obviously not your questionnaire right now, but it's something like, I would like to do a topic about depression or anxiety or body image, right? Things along those lines. If you know people in the class, you already know you'd like to work with them. You can just turn in one piece of paper with your ideas. I usually ask for like 3 ideas, just in case everyone in the class wants to do depression, right? So we have a little bit of variety. But you can turn in one with the people you want to work with. If you don't know people, turn in an individual one. I'll group you with other people who have similar ideas. So what will happen with the exams is like on the 7th, I would hand it out. And then you would just bring it back into class the next week and turn it in. Then we'll do intelligence and neuropsychological assessments. You'll have exam 2 in there. So again, fall break falls on a Thursday this year, so we won't have class. But what you have is a assignment on Blackboard, pretty low key. It's actually kind of fun. So it is a like career assessment that really feels more like taking like a BuzzFeed quiz. And then you write up a little assignment about your experience taking it. And then that goes to your partner for your assessment. And then your group will also at some point that week email me your IRB and we'll get those rolling. After fall break, we'll talk about personality assessments, which can include really long assessment measures or little short ones like you all are creating. A lot of the ones you all will create will be personality based. We'll talk about informal assessment and some of the ways that's used, particularly in school settings, things along those lines. Exam 3 will fall in there. We'll talk about diagnostic assessment. So when someone's sitting in front of you, how do you actually determine what their diagnosis is? Right. And we'll talk about the ethics of like, do we want to give people a diagnosis or not? Well, insurance won't pay for it if we don't give them a diagnosis, but it can also be stigmatizing. And then we will talk about how to write up an assessment report. You'll have a group project work day where you will work on You know, if you need that time, usually by that time people have some data, so you're working with the computers. But sometimes you need that time to actually, like, I've had people who, rather than doing their survey online, just printed it out on paper. And literally, oh my gosh, I felt so bad for them. One year when I taught it, there was a group who didn't give demographics, and I was like, it's okay, it's fine. And they're like, no, we want to do this right. So they just went over to the grill at a like popular time, and they got 30 people in like an hour. So you can do that if you need to at that point in time. Then we'll have no class for Thanksgiving. And then we'll come back and have a final like work day to be working on your assessment report. Sometimes people use this day to catch up if you missed an assessment with your partner. Work on finalizing that group project, that poster. And then the nice thing about night classes is they just have our exams scheduled, our normal exam time, our normal class time rather. So just the next Thursday will be our exam time, and that's when you all will present your posters and you'll turn in your assessment report on Blackboard. I have a very clear sort of schematic for the assessment report that you'll follow that actually makes it sort of plug and play. Any questions about anything on the syllabus? Things along those lines? Just a reminder in general, I believe it's actually the 29th this year. I don't think I updated these numbers. But you've got until next week to add or drop any course without it even showing up on your record, and you can just do it yourself in Blackboard. All right. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, that's 27th Monday.
Okay. All right, you're right. Just based on that date. Yeah. So it would actually be, hold that up, the 30th. So thank you for telling me that. Yeah, so this will be the 30th. It'll just be our normal class day. So I'll try to get that updated on there, but on your paper copy, just feel free to scribble in the right date. Thank you so much. I try to update all my dates, but I don't always do it perfectly, obviously. So cool. All right. Well, this kind of works out perfectly. It's 6:45. Let's go ahead and take a break until 7. I'll be up here if anyone wants to ask any questions. Feel free to get up, walk around, go get yourself something to eat or drink. And then at 7, we will start going through our first lecture. Alrighty, we'll go ahead and get started again. Other folks can roll on in. I wanted to take just another couple minutes to look at Blackboard just because there's a bunch of helpful resources on here. So as I mentioned, the lecture notes, the PowerPoints are here. I do talk quickly. So people have often told me they find it easier to follow if they either print the PowerPoint notes or like download them on their laptop and take notes that way. And so you'll see sometimes what we have are like PDFs and assignments. So assignments that we do will be through here as well. And then the group project, sort of everything is here throughout the semester of what you're looking for. I have an example poster of like what your final project will look like. This, I believe, no, that's not even the poster. I'll make sure this is the right link. But I think I have some samples that students have done for this class in the past, so you can see what other people have done or get ideas for, you know, the types of topics people have made questionnaires about. There are templates and instructions, things along those lines. As we work through assessment report materials, everything's going to be here throughout the semester. And then, as I mentioned, the recordings of class, I think the ones are still here from the last time I taught the class, if anyone's interested. But what I'll do is create a YouTube playlist for the semester and link that up here at the top. Yeah. I love that all the thumbnails are me just squinting at the screen to see if all the technology is gonna work. It's great. Alrighty. And one thing I want to go over real quick before we dive into the lecture is something I'm trying to look at in a lot of my classes this semester. And so a lot of my classes, I'll be talking about this sort of the second class. And that is the addressing model. And this is not something that you formally have to do right now, but it is something to kind of think about as we think about assessing people, as we think about imagining being in a room with someone, that your decision based on this assessment might determine whether they get an IEP, whether they get a diagnosis, whether they get funding, right? And so this was made by a psychologist named Pamela Hayes. So I thought I'd give her a little credit and put her up there in the corner. And so basically addressing just stands for different areas where you might have, she calls it power and less power. I probably prefer privilege and less privilege. And so it's ways to think about what positionality you're coming from and how that might differ from someone you're working with as a potential client. We know, for example, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about ethics next week, but just having, like, if your client is a person of color, just having an assessor who's also a person of color, they score better, even if they're giving the exact same instructions and doing the assessment the same way. So we have to kind of think about, how are we assessing people? How is that affecting them? How is who we are and how we present in the room going to affect people? And it's something that I need to think about as your professor as well. So I actually am going to disclose this, and Hayes refers to this as social location. So sort of where you are located socially. And so I thought a little bit more intro to me, so you know who's in front of you as you're looking at this. So the first thing she looks at is age and generational influences. So I am an adult, which in and of itself has privilege. We tend to not privileged children and elderly folks, but I'm a millennial, and I'm what they call an elder millennial or a xennial, or the one I like to call is the Oregon Trail generation, because that was the game that was our gaming back in the day, y'all. And I'm not gonna remember the exact quote, but the Washington Post just posted an article recently that was like steeringly accurate, that basically said that, you know, people who are part of my generation have just been continually screwed over by major life events. Actually, I might be able to find it because I posted it on my threads, which no one seems to really know what that is. Those born between 1981 and 1996 have been called the unluckiest generation. Since entering the workforce, they've experienced the slowest economic growth of any age group. They've also been weighed down by student debts and childcare costs. So unfortunately, your generation is starting to get some of the same BS we've had to deal with. So things to think about. In terms of developmental disability and also acquired disability, I am lucky to be temporarily able-bodied. You might be like, why is it temporarily? Well, I don't like to think about it this way, but I could get hit by a car tomorrow, right? And then my disability status would change. And so we are all temporarily able-bodied, those of us that are. And that's certainly a place of privilege. In terms of religion and spiritual orientation, I currently attend a Unitarian Universalist church, which most people have never heard of. But I was raised Christian, which is something of more privilege. So I sort of have a mix there, but most of mine are places of privilege, and I fully acknowledge that. In terms of race and identity, I'm clearly white. I'm like about as translucent as you can get, right? Fully acknowledge that. Whenever someone asked me to come speak about diversity issues, like I was on a Black Lives Matter panel a few years ago, and I'm like, let's address the elephant in the room. I'm super white, right? And I'm European American, right? So that's definitely a place of privilege. In terms of SES, Virginia Wesleyan does pay me well and give me good benefits. My husband also has a very good paying job, so we are privileged to be upper middle class. And really, in terms of SES, even though I know a lot of you struggle and have to do multiple jobs to be able to attend college, you're still higher up than a lot of people who are like, this would never be an option, right? So just sort of thinking about that in terms of the ability to be in this room in and of itself being a privilege, right? I'm heterosexual, so got the privilege there. I'm non-native, definitely privileged there. So I am born in the US, but I'm third generation Polish immigrant. My grandmother came over on the boat from Poland. My grandfather was the first of his family to be born in America. My mother was raised in a little, it's like a city within a city in Detroit called Hamtramck. That was basically everyone was there from Poland at that time. They all spoke Polish and unfortunately were looked down upon. So I kind of got a mix here, certainly mostly privileged though. And then in terms of gender, I am cisgender, right? So I'm not trans, I'm not gender non-binary. So that is a place of privilege. But unfortunately, in our society, still being a woman holds a place of less privilege. So I do have a mix there. So again, this is just a way to think about what do we bring to the table? How do we address this? Which is why it's called the addressing model. And I will post this later, but there are like questions you can ask yourself about what type of privilege do I have, that I've linked here as well. So again, especially in a class where you'll see in today's lecture, psychology and the history of assessment, it ain't pretty, y'all. We're gonna talk about some really messed up stuff that psychologists have thought and done. We need to be thinking about these things, right? Who is making the tests? Who are they testing them on? And then who are they actually being used on in day-to-day life? And is that right? Is that fair, right? So we're going to think about what is assessment and what is the history? How did we get to where we are today? Oh, and one thing I didn't say earlier is that I do keep closed captions up while we are doing this, because I know if anyone has, I have the privilege of being able to see and hear just fine, but if anyone has some hearing difficulties, not being able to read my lips, I know can be problematic. So I try to increase accessibility by having the captions up. All right, so here are some questions for thoughts. So just throwing it out there to everybody, based on what we've said on the syllabus so far, what you've experienced maybe in your past or seen family members, friends go through, what do you think assessment is? And there's definitely no right or wrong answer here. Yeah.
Just kind of picking through the brain of someone else, trying to help them figure out what's going on and what their goals are to move forward.
I love that way of looking at it. Yeah, picking through somebody else's brain. Love it. Anybody else? Other ideas? Yeah, you could think about it as testing, sorting, doing detective work. Why should we have a whole class about assessment? Yeah.
You should probably know what you're administering, like why you're administering it, who you should administer to, how to score it, or use handout assessments.
Yeah. And that's such a good point. So when I was in grad school, I'm trying to count on my fingers. I think I had 4 actual classes about assessment in my first couple of years. And then I also did different practica where we were supervised as we did assessment as well. So yeah, certainly making sure you know what you're actually doing, right? Not just sending people in there. We talked already about why you all decided to take the class. And I kind of gave you a hint as to like the types of psychologists who use this. Basically anyone in an applied setting, and oftentimes people in research settings as well. Alrighty, so we're going to go over some definitions. So psychological assessment is the process of using scientifically grounded methods. So again, psychology is a science, assessment comes out of science. So we're using scientifically grounded methods to collect, interpret, integrate, and report data. So collect, interpret, integrate, and report data. And these, because it is psychological assessment, are going to pertain to various aspects of psychological functioning. So you're using something that comes from the science to get some data, interpret it about people's psychological functioning. So it's a broad array of evaluation procedures that are going to give you information about a person. An important note that will become almost immediately apparent in this course is that psychological assessment is very scientific in nature. It is all based on research. We're always doing research to refine our assessment. Psychology itself is a science. It kind of straddles between natural science and social science, and different institutions kind of place at different localities. At Kenyon, where I went to undergrad, it was a natural science. So it was grouped with like bio and things like that. Here we classify it as a social science, but fully acknowledge, that there are brain-based things that we look at. And when you're doing an assessment, it's usually better to get as many sources of information as possible without unduly burdening the person you're assessing, because you want as much of a picture of what's going on with them as possible. You want to, usually when you do assessment, you're trying to answer a question about that person, whether it's what is their diagnosis, does this person need an IEP for their learning disability, is this person potentially incompetent to stand trial, right? And you want as much information as possible to be able to answer that question accurately. Psychological testing is like a subset of assessment. It's when you use an instrument. And what's an instrument? These are various tests that yield scores based on data that you get. So when you give someone a test, even if it's just the questionnaires you all are going to make up, let's say you give them a 10-item questionnaire, they answer on a scale of 1 to 5. When you're done, you have numbers, you have data, right, from each individual person. And those numbers can be interpreted to give you something that means something. So psychological testing is the process of administration, scoring, and interpretation. So administration, scoring, and interpretation. And this picture that you see here is someone administering. They're giving this person an intelligence test, which has very clear instructions, even down to like, where should material be placed? Like how far on the table to the person, right? So that's the administration. Scoring is afterwards. You take and you add up values and things along those lines. And then once you have those scores, you interpret them. You make a conclusion based on that. And it's going to be scientifically grounded. You're going to hear me say that a lot. And it's also going to be standardized. So just like I was saying, where she put this book was dictated to her in her instruction manual. Other tests are similarly standardized. You give the same instructions, you give the same questions in the same order. And again, because this is psychological testing, we're measuring psychological constructs. So that's what we do in today's day and age in modern psychology around the globe, really. But where did it come from? When did we start doing this? Well, the first documented psychological assessment that we've traced so far, this is not to say there wasn't some in sort of prehistorical times when they didn't document things. The first record we have is 4,000 years ago in ancient China. So every 3rd year, there were oral examinations for civil service. And then during the Han Dynasty, they actually had test batteries where they used 2 or more different types of tests together to determine which type of civil service you should do. Did you have the wherewithal to be part of the military? Did you know about geography, civil law, things along those lines? During the Ming Dynasty, they had multi-stage testing programs and they had testing centers. So if anyone in here has ever taken the GRE or anything like that, You actually go to like a testing center to take it, and that comes all the way back to the Ming Dynasty. So what they think happens is that Western culture, as they were learning about China through trade routes and missionary trips, they learned about these assessment procedures and they brought them back to Europe initially and then other areas. And so you might be like, well, Charles Darwin was not a psychologist, Dr. Myers. Very true. He was a biologist, right? But he had some ideas about individual differences. And again, there's a reason this course for, what is it, 50 plus years now, 60 plus years, has been called assessment of individual differences, right? And that's really what it boils down to when we're looking at assessment results, is what's going on with this person sitting in front of me, this individual. And so he had these ideas that carried forward. Jean Esquoyot was a French physician, and he worked with those who back then would have been called feeble-minded. As short ago as maybe 15 years, we might have called them mentally retarded. Now we tend to speak more of like developmental delays and things along those lines. But he was looking at language to identify intelligence. Here's where we start to get into some of the, right? Of like, ooh, why was he doing that, right? What was the purpose of that? Was he trying to get those people help, or was he trying to like kind of shut them away? And then Edouard Squin, he was also French, also interested in sort of the people who were on the low end of the intelligence spectrum. And he looked, though, beyond just language. He looked at movements and sensory motor response as part of intelligence. Alrighty, and then we get to Francis Galton. Does anyone know who he is? This dapper gentleman right here. He was actually Darwin's cousin. And he is the one who took Darwin's theory and applied it to humans. So a lot of people attribute this sort of social idea of survival of the fittest in humans to Darwin himself. It was actually Galton who took and applied it in that way and kind of honestly misapplied it in a lot of ways. Galton studied sensory and motor functioning, and these are cognitive psychological constructs. In 1884, there was a big health exhibition in London, and he had what he called the anthropomorphic laboratory. And he tested over 10,000 people on these constructs during this health exhibition. He was interested in how these variables might be associated with each other. The major problem with Galton is he was a eugenicist. So if you're not familiar with the concept of eugenics, it's the idea that certain people should be allowed to breed and others should not. It's essentially dog or horse or other livestock breeding, but for humans. And so these are the people who would say, oh, people of color, people who are poor, people who are feeble-minded shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. Right, and they would try to use these ideas, their assessment results, as proof that, oh, look, this is showing differences, when sometimes they created it to show differences, racially, ethnically, things along those lines. So this is problematic, and this is one of the big things of the history of psychology. The American Non-Psychological Association, about 3 years ago now, I think, actually put out a formal apology for the racist history of psychology of the field. And things like, you know, again, Galton was not a psychologist, but his ideas influenced some people who were specialized in assessment. These are problematic, right? And we need to acknowledge this history of our field, and not just be like, look how great these guys were. So Galton did contribute interestingly to some of the more modern mathematical things as well. So he came up with the idea of correlating or looking at the relationship between variables. And then his student, Carl Pearson, developed the Pearson correlation coefficient, which is probably one of the most widely used statistical tests today still. So again, good comes out of that, and how do we process that, right? Galton's research and Pearson's ideas about mathematics were extended by Cattell, who was a hugely important figure in American psychology. Cattell coined the term mental test to talk about assessment. We'll talk about Cattell much more throughout the semester. At the same time as this sort of like applied idea and figuring things out was happening, psychology itself as a field really was sort of birthed in academia. It came out of philosophy departments and was really based in experimental psychology. And so there were different ideas or schools of thought at the time. So one was positivism, and this is like a philosophical school, a frame of thought. And the idea here is that in order to advance knowledge, you have to test ideas. And to us today, that sounds like, well, yeah. But back then, I mean, people just thought, I can sit around and talk about it all day. I'm a philosopher, we just philosophize, right? And even modern philosophy doesn't just do that anymore. But there were people within the field of philosophy who said, no, let's test this. And they were the people who became psychologists. So in order to advance knowledge, you have to expose ideas to falsification. You have to say, could this idea be wrong? Let's look at it empirically. Behaviorism is the idea that you want to observe behavior, and it has to be something you can see with the naked eye or maybe measure with an instrument. Pure behaviorists thought what you're thinking didn't matter at all. Like Skinner, who's a big name behaviorist, thought of the mind as a black box, that it doesn't matter. Clearly, again, modern psychology doesn't go with this, but we kind of have to, again, find out about our roots. And then empiricism was the idea that we needed observable, replicable tests. Okay, if we're gonna test this stuff, whether we're observing behavior or doing thought experiments, we need to come up with scientific ways that someone else can do and check us to make sure that we did it right. At the same time as psychology really became this sort of scientific discipline, psychiatry was developing as a medical discipline and an implied discipline. This is where you had psychoanalysis. This is where Freud came in. He was trained as a psychiatrist. And they were trying to describe and label disorders, but it was like they were over here doing their own thing, and then the psychologists were over here doing their experimental thing, and they hadn't started really talking to each other yet and figuring out scientific ways to test those things. All right, so then we had Wilhelm Wundt, he's credited with being the father of psychology. He set up the first psychology laboratory. All right, so then we started working and coming up with tests that we can give to multiple people. They're set in stone. Unfortunately, these were also, again, when we talk about educational tests, we'll talk about these more. These were also largely set up to kind of screen out people who were feeble-minded. And again, had a little bit of a eugenicist bent behind them. So again, we just need that knowledge. But the Binet-Simon scale was one of these first intelligence tests. The first one was in 1905. And the idea was there are 30 items. They start out easy, they get harder. And you're trying to identify intellectually subpar individuals. They had a standard sample they tested it on. It was 50 kids, and they did it in standardized conditions. At the time, that was sort of revolutionary to have that sort of sample. Today, that would be kind of laughable, like standardized samples now are tens of thousands of people, but we had to start somewhere. In 1908, they changed the format, they added more items, they about doubled them. And then they had a sample of 200 kids for their standardization. This is where they came up with the idea of this mental age. Again, we'll talk about this more later, but the idea was that you have an actual age, right, based on how long you've been on the earth. And then you have a mental age based on your performance relative to other kids. In 1911, they put out another minor revision. And then they were French, Binet and Simon. There's probably actually Binet and Simon. But then someone from America was like, oh, this seems like a good thing that maybe we should use. So they developed and revised it for US use, and they called it the Stanford University Binet scale. They added many more items, and now we're getting a bigger standardization sample of 1,000 people. So in World War I, we started to be doing more assessments. And so sort of hearkening back to ancient China, we were looking at military recruits. We needed a lot of people to go fight, but we also needed to make sure that we were sending people who knew, basically we needed like informed decision makers, right? We couldn't send someone off to die who didn't understand that that's a possibility. And we also wanted people who would be able to follow orders and execute commands. And they came up with 2 different tests. There was the Army Alpha, and this required reading. And then there was the Army Beta, which was made for people who were illiterate. So they weren't saying if you're illiterate, you can't be in the Army. They just came up with a different test. So this really influenced the development and use of tests in general, and later led to the types of achievement tests that people take all the time with their education, whether that be the SAT, whether that be your test you have to take to graduate, things along those lines. Another big area of assessment, and honestly a lot of what we do in both clinical and social psychology, is personality tests. So personality tests are looking at traits. And a trait is a relatively enduring idea, concept, disposition that distinguishes us from one another. So again, individual differences coming back up. So it's something that we have, a property, a concept, a disposition that we can be different to other people on. Simple one to think about is like introversion, extrovert, right? People tend to think of that as like a flip of a coin, but in fact, it's a variant, right? There you might be kind of extroverted and kind of introverted. Sorry about that, y'all. And that's okay, right? You differ from other people on that. So there were structured personality assessments where you started to formally test this, as opposed to how would you all figure out someone's personality when you're meeting them for the first time? Ask them questions. Hey, who are you? What do you like to do? Right? Or you start to get to know them over time just from how they act, right? That's great, but not very specific. So we started to come up with various things. So projective tests. We'll do a whole lecture on this later in the semester, where people interpret vague stimuli or follow open-ended directions. And the idea is that because it's so vague, anything the person says is a projection of their personality, a projection of their inner self. So here's where you see things like the Rorschach ink blot test. You hold up an ink blot and you say, what might this be? And the person is, again, supposed to somehow project their personality into how they answer. Fun fact about the Rorschach is it was based on a parlor game called Blotto, where you literally, this is where they had like ink pens that they dipped into ink wells and they would just drip the ink, close up the paper, open it, and be like, ooh, kind of like kids looking at clouds on their backs. So that developed into the Rorschach. Then there's stuff like the thematic perception test or the TAT, where people are showed pictures that have people in them, and they have to tell a story about what's happening in the picture. And again, it's vague. And we'll look at the TAT later in the semester. Then we started to get into more structured personality tests. And so one example of this is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. You can just call it the MMPI, everybody else does. Which is, depending on the iteration, earlier versions were 567 items, now they're more like 350 items. And it's just sort of like a true false. The statement applies to me, the statement doesn't apply to me. Some examples of MMPI items. I'm never happier than when I'm alone. My hardest battles are with myself. Things along those lines. And again, each of these will flesh out more throughout the semester. Take some time to define some terms that are kind of come up throughout the semester. So a test, as we're going to use it, is a measurement device or technique. Measurement device or technique used to quantify behavior or to aid in understanding behavior. So I'll say that whole thing again because it's really wordy. A measurement device or technique used to quantify behavior or aid in the understanding and prediction of behavior. Why might you want to predict someone's behavior in the future? What could be examples y'all could think of in the psychological realm? A client sitting in front of you, why would you want to be able to predict their behavior? Yeah.
To know if they're dangerous themselves.
Exactly, that's one of the biggest ones, right? If someone comes to you and they're talking about harming themselves, you want to be able to say with pretty much accuracy, if I let them leave my office, will they be safe, right? Yeah, other ideas. We want to predict like how well a kid's going to do in school, right? Are they going to need some help? Are they going to need some additional time to just level the playing field for them? There are on the things like the MMPI, there are items that measure things like prediction for how well they'll do in therapy, right? There are people with certain disorders that like, unfortunately, the science of our therapy just hasn't developed good treatments for their disorder yet. People with what we call antisocial personality disorder, people who are psychopaths, they don't do well in therapy because they don't think anything's wrong with them. So why should they change anything? And in fact, the worst thing to do with those people is put them in group therapy because then they just get ideas from each other, right? Not great. So definitely thinking of that in different ways, thinking of what can we predict, what do we need to predict. A psychological test is a set of items designed to measure characteristics of human beings related to behavior. So characteristics of human beings related to behavior. And there's a couple different types of behavior that we look at. Overt behavior, O-V-E-R-T, is observable behavior. It's back to the behaviorists. It's what can I watch someone or even some animal do. When I was at the American Psychological Association conference a couple of weeks ago, I went to a session on dog cognition, which was awesome. I always love. They showed like little videos of the dogs doing that. One of the things they were doing is they were trying to see if dogs could be creative. So they gave them the command create. And when the dogs heard that command, they wouldn't get reinforced for any of their normal tricks. They had to come up with something new. And they showed this great video of the dog. It like picked up its toy and just like threw it at the trainer. And they're like, well, that's great. Good job. It's something you weren't trained to do, right? Can people do that? At what age can they do that? So that's overt behavior, what you can actually see. Covert behavior is a lot of what we look at in psychology. C-O-V-E-R-T, covert. These are things like feelings, thoughts, what knowledge you have, what abilities you have. These are hard to get at, and this is why the science of psychology is forever evolving and we're forever getting better. You know, I sometimes joke with my students, like, if I could have just like a UPC scanner, like scan your forehead and know how much of the knowledge you retained, you'd never have to take a test. It'd also be creepy and sort of like Minority Report-esque. We don't want to do that, right? But like, we don't have the ability to do that. Even our most advanced brain scanning technology is not there yet, right? So we've got to find sort of ways around measuring it through questionnaires, through tests, things along those lines. So another term you'll see a lot is scale. And this is where you have a group of questions, items that people are going to respond to. And when you add those up, you can relate the scores to something, some sort of psychological concept. So you might be relating it to a theoretical distribution, or maybe something like the normal curve, right? An empirical distribution. But it allows us to take these tests we work so hard on and start to interpret them. We mentioned traits just a little bit ago. And one of the things we always need to determine when we're doing a test is, are we going to be looking at traits, things that are relatively enduring across time and situation? Are we going to be looking at states, what someone's feeling right now or doing right now, right? So there are measures, for example, of self-esteem that are state measures. How are you feeling in this instant? There are measures of self-esteem that are trying to look at it more as like a personality trait. What is your general level of self-esteem? You can also have individual and group testing. So some tests you have to give on a one-on-one basis. If I'm giving someone a intelligence test, it's out loud most of the time. You need to be in a quiet space, just the two of you. If I'm giving someone a personality test, especially maybe a couple shorter ones for a research study, I could give them to everybody in this room at the same time, right? And so research a lot of times in psychology is going to be using sort of more that group mentality, but sometimes you need that individual. So for example, one of the things we have in our department, which Dr. Ariel sometimes uses for his research, is an eye tracker. And it's not like eye tracker like iPhone, it's EYE. And you can actually see where someone looks on the screen first and how long they look. That's something you have to test on an individual basis, right? All right, so some other terms that you'll hear: ability, achievement, and aptitude, and intelligence. So ability basically is like a broad term that includes these other three things. So it's like kind of everything you can do. Achievements is your previous learning. What knowledge have you gained? How have you been able to apply it? So previous learning is achievement. Aptitude is your potential to maybe acquire a certain skill, your potential to acquire knowledge. And then intelligence is your general potential to solve problems, acquire new knowledge, apply the knowledge you already have. Another thing you'll hear throughout the semester is a structured personality test versus a projective. And we already kind of talked about that. So the questionnaires you'll create, the MMPI, things along those lines, those are structured personality tests. The projectives are the things where you have to respond to this ambiguous stimuli in various ways. And then psychological testing is all the possible uses, applications, and concepts of psychological and educational tests. So everything you can do with assessment, essentially. So all possible uses, applications, and concepts of psychological and educational tests. All right, last thing for today. So I think pretty much, yeah, it looks like everybody has their computer or a tablet, or you can do this on your phone if you have that. So if you go to Blackboard, and you go to assignments. It's like the 6th or 7th thing down. There is this brief statistics quiz. Do not freak out. You're not going to get scored on it. You're just going to get 10 points for doing it. What this allows me to do is sort of test the waters and the temperature of like what people are coming in with for their knowledge. We will do some statistics stuff. We're going to learn how to do it together. We're going to do it together. So this is just, honestly, should take you 10 minutes or less, multiple choice. And if you look at these and you have no idea, just guess. Just go for it. At the end, there's a comment section where you can talk about your reaction to taking this quiz. And again, this is not, I'm not like, oh no, they don't know any stats. Well, of course you might not know them. This is just about y'all seeing where y'all are at. And it could be no one in here has any idea anything about statistics, and that's okay. And once you've completed this quiz, and hit it at the bottom, you hit submit, then you can head out for the night. That's all we're going to cover today. Yeah, and feel free to use your phone or one of those calculator websites to calculate stuff if you need to.